then I'll put
Yep.
it back.
And this is actually the speaker. Right?
Okay. All right, everybody. We're going to call to order this meeting. We're at Channy's cabin at Farm, and we're going to start this meeting of the J Project to give a bit of an update on what we've been doing for the last year, as well as engage in a bit of a conversation. Part of the mission of what we've been trying to do is really to educate the family and ourselves about the history of our family, so that we can better understand that history and then think about actual concrete steps to help improve racial justice in this country. So that's really the heart and soul of what we're up to at the J Project. And it's been a really exciting year. I think the way we're going to run this meeting is we're going to have a bit of quick updates from individual members of what they've been doing. And then we'll just kind of open it up to a discussion. That's really the agenda, pretty simple. And I'm going to kick it off by passing the mic to Peter, who is going to tell you about what he's been up to, which is really quite extraordinary.
All right. So basically what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a podcast that I'm calling Founding Truth. And it is uses our ancestry as a lens to focus people's understanding of slavery in the Northeast. And to that end, I've done a huge amount of research, and I continue to do research all the time. Something that's become clear to me is that our ancestors enslaved many types of people, and our ancestors were pretty diverse. We had an ancestor who was a Barbary pirate who led the largest slave raid on Ireland and captured over 100 Englishmen who were settlers in Ireland and took them back to Barbary, and they were slaves the rest of their lives. We also descend from an American Indian sachem who murdered Anne Hutchinson, kidnapped her daughter and raised her for a number of years and had a child with her that we descend from. We also, which is much more normal in our family, descend from a lot of very prominent New Englanders, including I found 9 people who we descend from that were on the Mayflower. 4 of them died the first winter, which was normal because half the people died the first winter on the Mayflower. But in addition to that, we descend from very, very prominent people, notably William Bradford and his son, William Bradford IV, which was the chronicler of the Mayflower was William Bradford III. William Bradford IV went on to lead the Plymouth militia, which committed terrible, horrible atrocities and enslaved at least 350 people. And so that legacy, that really dark legacy of colonialism, we're here because of it. You know, we wouldn't exist. Not one of us would exist without that man doing that thing. And so something that I constantly circle back to is about like how big an influence, like William Bradford is my 10th great grandfather. That's going way back. I mean, you have a lot of 10th great grandparents, many, many of them. So like how big a deal is that to me, right? And the context that I constantly put it in is I never met Pop. I never met him. He died way before I was born, like what, 1956 or something?
55.
55. Okay. So Pop, long dead, right? But has profound influence on my life. Pop was my great grandfather. Okay. His great grandfather, who was a man named Henry Hamilton Schieffelin, is by generation the most recent enslaver in our family. So when I think about the influence that Pop has on my life to this day, where I'm sitting right now, it's partially because of Bayard, because he bought this land, but Bayard wouldn't have bought this land if Pop hadn't bought that land, right? And we wouldn't be sitting here without Pop. We wouldn't be in this room together. And to just think about the influence that his great grandfather had on his life, you know, Henry Hamilton Schieffelin, the family company, down to to William J. Schieffelin, Pop, right? And so that wealth that is tied to our family traces a direct line back to enslaved labor. Henry Hamilton Schieffelin still owned slaves in the 1810 census. He still enslaved people in 1810. Slavery in New York State lasted till 1827. Okay. And so as I think about the purpose of my project, I think about getting people to understand this kind of hidden history, this history that's been in a lot of cases very intentionally obscured in the Northeast. And the biggest thing that obscured the history of slavery in the Northeast was actually the abolition movement. Was the abolitionists wanted to, it was too complex a history to present. And so very often they kind of buried these family stories of slavery, right? It's like William J. Schieffelin, as I was growing up, I always thought I descended from abolitionists, which is absolutely true. We descend from very significant abolitionists. William J., John Jay's son, was a leading abolitionist and really a wonderful man, right? And I think John Jay, who has a very mixed legacy on slavery, right? Because he enslaved at least 19 people. And he grew up the child of people who imported slaves into New York. Both his grandfathers and his father all imported slaves to New York City as a business, right? And so this legacy, right, we as a family forgot, right? And part of the reason we forgot was people like William J. were very adamantly abolitionist and tried to really, and William J. in particular, tried to change the story about his father from being an enslaver to being an abolitionist. And John Jay was an abolitionist, right? He signed into law the gradual manumission of slaves in New York State. He led the New York Manumission Society, which was, I think, one of the first, if not the first, abolitionist organization in the United States.
Pennsylvania had it first.
No,
No?
no, the New York State Manumission Society is 2 years older.
Okay.
2 years older than the Pennsylvania one.
Okay.
And so the real complexity of that is while he was leading the New York State Manumission Society, he enslaved people. 10 years after the gradual manumission of slavery law, John Jay still enslaved people. And so this legacy, right, that has been largely obscured by history and frankly economics, right, and family interest, I'm trying to resurface, because in our country, when we talk about things like reparations, people down south think, oh no, that's the Northerners trying to impress their will upon us, right? And it's not. Slavery is an American problem. America was founded by 13 slave colonies, right? It just so happened that half of them in the North ended slavery soon after, but not that soon. Slavery lasted for 52 years in New York State after the United States of America. And so what does that legacy look like? How does that legacy of our family carry on to today? Primarily economics, right? And so I'm trying to learn about, as much as I can, the descendants of people that we enslaved. And to that end, I've actually in September, I'm going to Martha's Vineyard to go to the Aquina Wampanoag powwow, annual powwow, because our ancestors enslaved their ancestors. And I've started a conversation with a tribal council member there who's the unofficial historian of the tribe. She's incredibly knowledgeable. And so I had a long conversation with her via Zoom. And she said, you should come to the powwow. And I thought about it for a day and said, you're right, I go there. So I'm trying to connect with the people who suffered at our ancestors' hands and understand like what today we can do for them. And so something like about the Aquina Wampanoag, when we talk about economics, the Aquina Wampanoag there were 4 bands of Wampanoag that inhabited Martha's Vineyard. Okay, only one of them has any existence today, basically. So the land in Martha's Vineyard was by hook and crook taken from the Wampanoag, and now the Aquinnah Wampanoag, which has federal recognition, they have a reservation that basically consists of the land that was given to them in the 1970s by the federal government on Martha's Vineyard that the federal government owned, and that land is the face of a cliff. It's a vertical piece of land.
Can you put a house there? Is there?
No, it's not the top, it's the face. It's the face of a cliff.
They were given a cliff?
They were given a cliff.
That's unbelievable.
And the reason they were given a cliff is actually good, because this cliff, Gayhead Cliff, has profound spiritual importance to the tribe. So it was a way that the tribe could be given a piece of land that they cared a lot about, but had no value, right?
Mm-hmm.
On top of that cliff, the tribe has a bunch of businesses that sit on land that they lease, that they rent from the town. So the land that their businesses operate on, that is like a primary way that their tribe gets revenue, they literally have to pay the town for that land to this day. And so that's the type of thing that I want to really look at. Like, can we help correct this? Why is this tribe, that this is their ancestral land, to this day paying rent on? I don't know the answer to that question. I think there's about 1,000 enrolled members. And the amazing thing about the Wampanoag, where their language was totally forgotten, right? It was completely forgotten. But the big but is the colonists tried really hard to Christianize the Wampanoag and largely succeeded. And because of that, there was a King James Bible translated into Wampanoag in the 1600s. And that Bible is like the Rosetta Stone, and the Wampanoag have reborn their language. They've brought their language back. And so that's one of the huge initiatives of the tribe, is to restore their language. And they're one of the few tribes where they can do that, because it was written down. It was published at Harvard. And so what? And they actually, there was a dictionary published as well. But also, as think about Harvard, Harvard was founded to educate Indians. And some of the very first Indian graduates of Harvard were instrumental in massive land theft.
Massive land
Theft. They basically were the translators who would show up and say, if you mark this paper, who knows what they told them, but what the paper said was the land becomes English. And so there's several key figures who were educated at Harvard, who were then basically the agents of taking land from indigenous people. And so that's actually like the second season of my podcast is really more about the land theft. My first season is really focused on slavery. And then this isn't part of the J family, but I found an ancestor of Virginia's named Jacob Lohman, who was the first settler in Elmira County, one of the very first settlers of Elmira County, after the genocide of the American Revolution pushed out the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois people, were ejected from central New York during the Richmond campaign. And so Jacob Lohman moved into this vacuum and became very wealthy. And he enslaved 2 people up to 1820, the 1820 census. And I believe they were Black people. I have, through Lohman family genealogy and my own genealogical work, found living descendants of those enslaved people. And they,
Is this Virginia you're talking about? My mother?
your mother.
Our
Yeah, so this is like Jervis Langdon's wife was Ida Clark,
Yeah.
and her great grandfather, I believe, was Jacob Lohman. Okay, so this is going way back to right after the American Revolution. And I've found this significant extended family who by the way, still lives in Elmira. And so I'm working with the president of the New York State Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society to basically reintroduce myself to this woman in hopes that our families can have some type of dialogue. Incidentally, I also think that our ancestor Jervis Langdon, who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad, also greatly aided members of this family later. And so it's a very complex history that we have in the Northeast, but it's something I think that we really need to engage about. In this situation, this family that I found a woman on Ancestry who's built this family tree. Her tree doesn't go back far enough to reach the enslaved people that were enslaved by our family. And so this is why the education is so important, right? I think it's like really important that this family knows that part of the reason where they still live there is because they were enslaved there. A lot like there's people in the South who are still doing that too. So it's this through line of history that is still affecting us today. And I'm still figuring it out. And that's like actually what's really intriguing about this project. Is I'm constantly learning new ways to be disturbed by our ancestors. And I think that that's fascinating and inspired by them. I mean, Jervis Langdon is a very inspiring person. William J. and John J. II, both quite inspiring people. And so anyway, I think it's vital work that we're doing. And I think the more of our family that we can get involved looking at this and discussing these issues, and in anti-racism work, there's a lot of talk of, white people having to do the work too, right? And so we need to do the work. You're trying to get Louie in your shirt. You want to come over here? You want him all the way in, or just a I don't know, man. That's a big thing. But that's basically it.
There's sugar. You want sugar?
Do you have a Bluey in your belly? Do you have a Bluey in your belly? No. So incidentally, the podcast is still, I'd say, in the first beginning stages of production. I've recorded quite a few interviews, but there's a long way to go. And
where will you put the podcast?
I'm going to put the podcast in all prominent places that podcasts go, like iTunes, and it'll be like I'll probably have a YouTube version of it. And but it's probably not going to be ready for at least another year. Like there's a lot of work.
It's a serious PhD research type project.
Yeah, but yeah. No, that's fine. Yeah, wear your glasses. I want you to see.
But I just want to say thank you, Peter. There was so much to this, and so clearly, and so much heart, but also so much clarity. That for now, I just want to.
Well, you're welcome. Yeah.
Peter, are there ways that people at this table can help you in this work?
Man,
Or,
that's a good question. I mean, my mom, she helps. She helps some. She's coming with me to the powwow.
Oh, great.
But I think having a way to and like Robert helped amazingly. One thing that we've discovered is that in the last year we learned that one of the J enslaved, who was a man named Caesar Valentine, who's an incredibly interesting man. According to everything that we had read and researched, he didn't have any children. If you talk to the people at the J Heritage Center, which actually has a large exhibit about him, because he spent most of his life at the J Heritage Center location. Okay. And according to them, he had no descendants. But in my ancestry research, I discovered a intestate letter in the Westchester County Courthouse, and basically to get an intestate letter from them, you actually have to physically go there. So Robert Cox went there and found this intestate will and discovered that Caesar Valentine was survived by 3 adult children. And I have actually traced those descendants up to 1910, where I've hit a dead end. And that's another thing that the New York State, the African American Historical and Genealogical Society is helping me to try and break that open, because there's a very good chance that, given that the family survived until the 1900s, that there are living descendants of that family. And so one thing I would like to do is, and something that I think is going on largely in New York State, is trying to give voice to the descendants of the enslaved. And I think that's a way that you can really raise up these ideas about these understandings about slavery in the Northeast, is to talk about, like, there's a ton of talk and history written about the experience of the descendants of Southern slaves.
Yeah.
And virtually none about the descendants of Northern slavery. And so, and why is there so little written about it? It's because when New York's, like, when the South ended slavery, right, there was some effort to help Black people. It wasn't very effective, right? There was 40 acres and a mule, which was promptly canceled, right? But there was something called the Freedmen's Bank, which ultimately failed in scandal. But when it existed, it helped people to an extent. It helped Black people. There was a large educational initiative, right? In the North, when slavery ended in New York State, there was very, very much, there was no federal support. So why is there no history? Because poor people don't get to write history. They have no means to record, or they have very few means to record what they experience. And
So you mean, in a way, that history is history of the rich people,
oh yeah, history is
Rich
history of
white.
the rich. Yeah,
the
rich.
rich white.
So yeah. So anyway, before we go too deep into that, I want you or Willie to talk about what you guys are doing with reparation generation.
I might just add, since Robert is not here, a couple of other things Robert has been doing is that he has been doing some of this because he's located in New York. He can go to some of the New York events that are held on the Van Cortlandt estate. There's a burial ground which has just been, well, in the last 5-10 years, been discovered, maybe 20, 30 enslaved people buried there. He's in touch with I've met also the director of the mansion on that piece of land, and they have different events. Robert attends those. Also, Robert has
just as a reference, John Jay is grandson of Van Cortlandt. So,
and
the land actually in Bedford is Van Cortlandt land, is my understanding. So a lot of Jay's wealth, and John Jay was a very wealthy man, comes from the Van Cortlandt family, who were some of the earliest Dutch settlers.
His mother apparently
That's Van Cortlandt with C or with K?
C.
Yeah, the same.
Apparently, I think it's either John Jay's mother or grandmother at the time in New Amsterdam was the richest woman, because the Dutch women could work, and it was claimed that she basically went to England, bought the shackles, went to Angola, and then brought the slaves back to the Caribbean and into the States. And she became the richest woman at the time.
She wasn't the richest woman, she was the richest person.
Richest person.
Richest person
in New Amsterdam.
in New York.
So, but another thing Robert has done is he went to the Livingston family. Sarah Livingston was John Jay's wife. Livingston's family, prominent New Jersey, New York family. Sarah Livingston's uncle was a slave trader.
And grandfather. And her grandfather. It's both her uncle and grandfather were both slave traders.
Okay, but
Yeah.
it's her uncle, Philip,
Yeah.
who was a Yale graduate of 1737 distinction, and there's a first endowed chair named after him. Robert met a black man named Chris Rabe, R-A-B-B, who was a class of 1992 Yale, black man who is directly descended from Philip Livingston. So he is a black man who has is of Philip Livingston. So that he's not directly related, but yes,
He's our cousin.
exactly. So maybe let's just Willie and Willie, hey, you're better at this than I. Did you hear me?
Yeah, why don't you do the Rep Gen part and then I'll do a couple of other things and because you're right there. So
So a segue, a good one from Peter has been talking about is, so the J project has been focused on educating ourselves, doing the research to do that, to spread the word. This is what we're trying to do among our family and eventually to a larger audience. But then the third thing is, what can we do actively to repair this curse that has essentially been part of the fabric of the way the country operates and the way people relate in this country, that the legacy of slavery permeates everything in this country, not the least of which is the economics. As Peter was saying, the economics was such that the enslaved person got absolutely nothing. When the Civil War was over, the 40 acres and a mule went into effect for 18 months. Lincoln was assassinated. Johnson came into the presidency and stopped that policy and withdrew the land that had already been given to, at that point, maybe 500 formerly enslaved people. So that's the way the government was behaving. So that, all of it sets way back the situation, as Peter was saying. John Jay, his family, we ride on the riches that they made on the backs of enslaved people who to this day are still, the descendants are still struggling to buy a house, get well educated, put food in their mouth, all kinds of things. So Willie and I have been involved with this organization called Reparation Generation. It was started in 2022 in California by some white second generation Jewish folks. They felt after the George Floyd riots, or the death and the total, racist attack, they felt they had to do something. And they came up with this organization, which is now underway, Reparation Generation. What it is, because these fellows that started this were second generation Jews. Their parents came to this country just around the time of the war The fathers went into the army, received the benefits of the GI Bill, which African Americans did not. The soldiers coming home did not. These founders are benefiting. They're not as well to do as most of us here at this table, but they're flourishing upper middle class citizens of this country. So what they did was long and short, Willie and I have become, and the others among us who are part of this, have sort of made a commitment to join them in this particular way. What they do is in Detroit, where the housing stock is reasonable compared to most urban areas, and where there is a fairly sizable African-American population, this organization is granting $25,000 to individuals who pass certain criteria for them to be able to purchase their first house, because so much of wealth passes through property. This is one way. I mean, there are many ways, but this is one way we've determined is a good way to try to make some repair. And this organization wants to grow it themselves into it, like a pilot project, demonstrating how you can repair the damage that the legacy of slavery has had on African Americans. The folks that are eligible must be able to show that they actually descend from an enslaved person. That's not easy to do. I have a dear friend, she can only go back 2 generations in her family history. These folks have to go way back to when slavery existed. This organization provides African American genealogists for free to help individuals who are looking to become homeowners. And if they can, with the help of the genealogist, they can show that they were related to an enslaved person, they would become eligible. Just the process of doing that work is healing for people. So the reparative action is not just in the economics of being able to put the money down for your first house. It's also to be able to find your identity in some way. We know, I mean, look, like Peter has been able to find out about people that lived, well,
400 years ago.
yeah, and it wasn't easy, but it was certainly easier than what it is.
It's pretty easy.
Yeah, okay, well, then it is pretty, okay, whatever.
Finding out about slavery hard. Finding about our ancestors because they were the elite is,
Yeah.
very well recorded.
Anyway, so as a action point that we have the J project in its infancy has taken on is to make transfers. They're not, for tax purposes, they're considered contributions, but for talking about it and for showing how we're not giving this to you because you're so deserving. We are transferring it because we owe it to you. It's that was money that should have been exchanged back in the first days when we should not have had slavery. So it's a different concept mentally, and I think it really goes to this point that it's trying to have people rethink where they are in the space of being an American. And for our family, being part of the J family, it's even more to the point, because our J family ancestors were very engaged in making wealth for themselves on the backs of these other folks. I have information about this organization. I can send it out to people. There are several different ways to make a transfer. So our first transfer among the group of us that made made our transfer was for $25,000, so that we have now got that in their pipeline, where they do the vetting, where they have, this is such a cool organization, because they have African-American realtors, lawyers, advisors in Detroit. I mean, this is really a very integrated organization. The new CEO is African-American. When the new grantee is selected, there are mentors that help them with what is the responsibilities of owning a home, paying its taxes, all of the details of owning a home. It's a big deal, and they need, initially, anybody like going to a new school, you need some extra help. Anyway, that's my end of it. It's a very exciting time, I think, for potential for our family, but also this is big in this country, that there's an effort to correct the wrongs. That
Detroit, the only place that's doing it.
at the moment, that's the pilot location. Yes.
And so let me just add about one thing about RepGen model. RepGen, which is short for reparation generation, their model is they're trying to, with private money, to demonstrate and to study how reparations can work. And so they see Detroit as the pilot where they can try this out. They can get statistics, they can get stories to try to sell bigger reparations. They understand that any privately funded reparations system in this country is probably going to be insufficient for the problem. But there is such resistance to the idea of a publicly funded version. They're trying to, and they want to do it now, so that they're doing these pilot projects as an example to be able to educate people and be able to demonstrate that reparations work, right? And that reparations matter, and that reparations are possible. And they're doing that with private funding.
Now, have they done it with other $25,000?
They've had 2 funding rounds, and this is the 3rd funding round.
And they have 2 candidates in the pipeline that need funding.
Do they have like a website where we can look it up? And
Absolutely.
read about what they're doing and who the families are, or things like that?
Yes, it's reparation generation.org. We'll send out some kind of
Yeah.
email.
That would
You might, Shani, you might mention the meeting in Brooklyn, the house party, how they get people together.
Thank you. Yes, so sort of the upshot of our making the transfer. We've been working with the founders and the new CEO, and we're going to hold a house party. That's their, I mean, this is a beginning group. I mean, they're growing, and one of the ways they grow is through house parties. And it's going to be held in Brooklyn the end of September. And we will be inviting our relatives from the New York area, and Rep. Jen has some folks that they will be inviting as well, so we're hoping it'll be a nice gathering for people to learn about Rep. Jen and to learn about the J projects. Becoming with them a pretty significant beginner founder. We're not in the founding part of this, but
So we're not founding fathers. Just-
no, but we are founding fathers that are joining to help support this. Okay, Willie, take it. You can
Okay.
just need to be plugged in.
No,
Hi.
right.
Can you all, hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
I can see you.
You can see me. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you, Peter, and thank you, Shani, for really wonderful descriptions of the work. I don't have much to add, except I do want to add a couple of projects that we're also working on and that are in various stages of activity. And one is a project that I'm working on called the GI Bill Restoration Act. And you've heard a little about how the GI Bill provided benefits in housing and education and startup assistance to servicemen coming back from the war. And in fact, that program has followed every single, it exists today, and it has followed every war and every serviceman who has been in one of the services since the 1940s. And as you also heard from either Peter or Shani, that those benefits were systemically denied the Black population, primarily because all of the offices of the VA servicing organization were manned locally, staffed locally as a compromise to Southern politicians. When they passed the GI Bill, the decision was made to distribute the administration of the benefits to local offices, which of course gave power to the local, usually pretty racist staffs of the VA. And those benefits were systematically denied to the Black servicemen. And there have been several efforts, none of which have been successful yet, to correct that. And we're trying to put together a coalition of folks. My big idea, and I don't know if it'll work or not, is to assemble all of my college classmates and those of some other Ivy League schools into a lobby group that would call their congressman and get this passed, probably after the next election. But the idea is to expand the GI benefits to the descendants of people who were denied them, and that would pretty much cover a lot of the harm, and to provide those people, those descendants, home loan and later educational assistance. And it would be a first step in sort of widespread government support for reparations. And we've sort of tested this with conservative friends and as well as progressives. And the conservatives like this idea. They don't like the idea of general reparations, but they do like the idea of helping level the playing field and correct a very visible harm that was done to patriots who were Black. The second thing that I'm working on, besides the Rep Gen project, is a memorial to one of the more troublesome stories of slavery in the J family. And that is the story of Abigail, who was a young woman you may have read about a couple of years ago, which was this story in the New York Times was a real impetus for several of us to get involved. But the story is that a young enslaved woman named Abigail, who we think was given to Sarah Livingston Jay, John Jay's wife, as a wedding present, accompanied the Jay family to Europe in the late 1770s and early 1780s, when Jay was sent to Paris to negotiate with Ben Franklin and John Adams the peace terms ending the Revolutionary War. That Abigail accompanied the family as a servant to Sarah, and that she that she saw what liberty looked like. She escaped from the family in Paris. She was tracked down and imprisoned. She caught some sort of infection in prison in Paris, and she came home to the Jay family house in Passy, part of Paris, where she died. And this story of this young Black woman searching out her own freedom while Jay was negotiating the freedom of the entire country, who of course was white, because Blacks were property then, they weren't people, sort of struck us as it was a real blow and a real eye-opener of the hypocrisy and problems with this kind of duality and how we approached this population. And in many ways, I think it galvanized us into doing more and digging deeper. And so one of the things, this was an idea that Ben had, was let's try to get a memorial to Abigail to tell the story of this somewhere in Paris. So I've been working with an organization in Paris called the Memorial, the Foundation for the Memory of Slavery, which is interested in transatlantic or Atlantic slavery, more than just the sugar colony slavery, which the French were involved in. If you remember, they owned Haiti, Saint Domingue it was called, the largest and most profitable slave colony on earth, and the first one that had the major slave revolution run by Toussaint Louverture. And they're interested in going beyond just the French sugar colony experience. And they're interested in this story, but everything's been put on hold with the Olympics, and they've also had a change in organization at the top, this foundation. And so it's moving slowly, but there is some interest there in working with us to establish some kind of plaque or storytelling on one of the buildings that have relevance to the story. I think it's the women's prison in the right bank, Marais area of Paris, where it would be appropriate to have a plaque that would tell the story. The other thing I'm looking at in my work beyond the RepGen work is trying to close the gap between history and current times. One of the things that I think and I've experienced that people have trouble with is they look at the history of slavery and they say, well, that happened then, and didn't we have Reconstruction, and didn't we have all sorts of civil rights laws, and didn't we have all sorts of corrections that made the problem go away? And so I'm not really, even though I'm sympathetic, I can't really feel responsibility for what happened 100, 200 years ago. And that would be true, I suppose, if you could point to the status of Black Americans and say they're really now on an equal footing with whites. But that hasn't happened. In fact, the wealth gap between Black families and white families is larger than ever. So something's been going on since slavery that has been responsible for that result, for that condition. And I've been I've been researching that and looking and reading and looking at that. And a lot of the things that pop up are, of course, known to everybody, but there are few places where it's all been pulled together that would prove the through line from slavery and what I call the antecedents, or not the antecedents, but the children, the offspring of slavery, the policies, the actions that kept the spirit of slavery and the spirit of the unlevel playing field alive right up until the present time. And there's a wonderful new game. I guess a lot of things start with games. A game that's been developed, and I found this through the RepGen people, and I'll send it around to folks if they're interested. It's called the Racial Wealth Gap Learning Simulator. And it's a long name, I know, but it does capture exactly what this is. And it's a simulation you play with friends or family. It's a little bit, as best I can determine, like Monopoly. You sort of gather points, you pay points, and it's really a history of the policies that have been put in place since the Civil War, since the abolition of slavery, that have kept the spirit of slavery and the economic inequalities alive right through the present day. And it's a good way, I think, of teaching people that this is not a problem that existed long ago and that we really don't have responsibility for. But in fact, it's something that's alive today because of these policies and because of these realities that are a straight line through what was going on before the Civil War and what's going on now. So those are really, the things I'm working on. I'm most interested in the repair part because I'm old and I'm not going to be here that long, and I want to do something before I go. And those of us who feel the same way and have some resources that aren't all needed by their families, I think for me, it's a very comforting and relieving thing to be working on this.
So time,
Thank you, Willie.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Oh, we have a question from Alita.
Oh, go ahead.
Willy, thank you very much for what you're doing. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear me?
Yes, we said that.
RepGen is fantastic, and I mean, I'm of course in Europe, in Britain, but I also have a very wide network of people working in these various areas for the last 50 years. Not in the very wonderfully focused way that you and Jenny and Peter are doing, but some ideas have cropped up for contacts that I might be able to make and lay in relation, particularly to the Abigail project in France. May I tell people in my network about it?
Yes.
It's of what you have said.
Absolutely. And I will send you the link to the article that describes all of this much better than I can, which was written by a Black historian at Johns Hopkins named Martha Jones. And it traces the entire story of Abigail, yes.
Yeah, it so happens that I know some Abigails who might be in Europe who might be very interested in this material. So, and might be able to do something also theatrically around it. So that, which would be quite exciting. So I'll just do some schmoozing, and maybe we'll even see you before we leave Britain. But
Before we leave here.
Yeah, before we leave for the United States. But thank you, and I'll be in direct contact then with you and when I have the material.
Well, that's great. If you're still here next week for art service, Lynn and I are coming up, so we'll be able to maybe have a coffee or something.
Thank you.
And we
Anyone
had some
else?
discussions about this last year, and with Jay and Brooke as well, and part of what we talked about is it would be nice to have some kind of plaque or memorial somewhere, but if you don't have kind of programming alongside it, it's really kind of dead. And it doesn't
Yeah,
connect. to
But it
people.
can be brought to life.
Exactly. So that's fantastic. And this is exactly what we wanted to do is just get people engaged and learn about different projects where you can kind of sink your teeth into them depending on your interest, your network, where you have energy. All of these projects that we're talking about, they're all kind of loosely under the umbrella of the J Project. And it's all kind of part of our effort to, address these issues in different ways as appropriate. Fantastic.
One of the things we have discovered in our efforts to honor those that were enslaved is that it is not we are not in a position to create that plaque. It's those that descended from the enslaved that really need to be engaged and involved. And it's finding people in Westchester County to meet with who would be interested in making some kind of plaque for the grave site of Zilpha, the enslaved woman who lived with the J family even after she was manumitted. And William J made sure that she was buried in the J plot in Bedford. So then there's a large headstone, that's not the same kind of stone, but similar to all the other headstones, like for Mary, Aunt Mary, for William J. And there's no observance to indicate that this is a place where an enslaved woman is buried, enslaved by John J. But in order to even approach that, to do that, it's really we've been advised it's very important to engage the African American historical folks in that area.
Yeah.
To come up with the language, to come up with the, they may not want it. I mean, I've been told the church might not want it because you bring too many people looking at it. So, I mean, I don't know.
There's very few examples in the country of an enslaved person being buried in the family plot.
Yeah,
Right.
no, I got
And
that,
so it sort of complicates the whole narrative, which is kind of part of what we're trying to do.
which is part of the whole point here.
Exactly.
And kind of a question also, another one, and that is, this is peripheral, but it's pointing to a possible future direction of some interest. I've learned in my reading around this stuff that quite a significant number of Native Americans, is particularly in the beginning, were enslaved, starting in the first contacts at the time of the 17th or 16th century, 17th century. And then, and this, there were for quite a long time, there were more Native American slaves than there were Black slaves. Has there been any effort, or is there any information to at least contact or find out from descendants of Native American slaves in this country? Because it's a really untold story, very untold.
So the short answer to that question is I'm trying to make those contacts.
Brilliant.
And it, the history of slavery in the Northeast in particular really centered for a long time on the enslavement of American Indians. Like in Rhode Island, for instance, where we had this ancestor Edmund who died. In his will, he had 3 Indians listed as indentured servants. Well, they were listed as property, but the value was so low that in the context, they were almost certainly indentured servants. What's interesting about it is he lived in a place called Little Compton, Rhode Island. He was a very prominent man. I understand he was the Attorney General of Rhode Island. This is very early in Rhode Island. And what's interesting about it is the two of the men who were his indentured servants were brothers. And their mother was the sachem who owned all of the land that became Little Compton, Rhode Island. So they went from being basically set up to own the town to being an indentured servant for the rich people in the town. And so how did that transition happen? Right. And when I spoke to this really wonderful woman who's the historical, unofficial historian of the Aquinnah tribe, I asked her, like, what is the kind of common tribal understanding of how slavery impacts? And basically the answer is this information about slavery of American Indians in the Northeast is new to them too. Because the history wasn't passed on. It was so thoroughly obscured. Like she actually has a 30-year career as she worked at Plymouth Plantation, and then that became Plymouth Patuxet is now they call it. And then she curated a couple of museums, and she actually in like 2018 or something curated an exhibit about Indian whalers, when Indians moved into whaling very heavily. And in that exhibit, she did not once even talk about debt bondage, because in 2018, no one was talking about debt bondage. But the reason Indians became whalers was they were so poor that they would indenture their children to a whaler at the age of like 12 or 13 to get some money from the whaler to be able to feed their family. And so there were whole generation upon generation of Indians in the Northeast were indentured to whalers because they were so poor. And so even though she now knows about it, it's really recently unearthed history. And I think that what's interesting about this moment is we get to grapple with it together, this new history. We get to come to it together. But yes, slavery, the beginning of the New England colonial project. It predated any settlement in New England. And the reason the Pilgrims survived was primarily because they got a translator, Squanto, who himself had been a slave. And so the reason we're here is because the English slaves in New England. And it goes back, I think the first instance that I've read was like 1607. Yeah, something like that. And actually what's interesting is, I think it was like 1605, 1607, the English actually kidnapped the leader of the Aquinnah Wampanoag. And this man managed to make his way back to Martha's Vineyard and then became the chief of the Aquinnah Wampanoag, and in a lot of ways helped steer them through conflict. And during King Philip's War, which is also known as Metacom's War, the Aquinnah Wampanoag largely were able to stay out of it, and that I think that helped a lot. You know. So you wanted to mention something. So I wanted to.
Oh, I mean, I liked Willie. I liked your idea about the game of Monopoly, which sounds like a game that the white people win, and that's and I'm struck by in this meeting. There's a couple people from the younger generation, i.e., younger than 60, but not a lot at this table. And so, trying to think of things that might be exciting, fun, interesting ways to participate, and just to say a little bit that I've probably already shared with all of you, but about my own experience, about how I've been inspired by the J Project. And this stuff was all complete news to me because my grandmother Osborn told me that we were descended from, among the most illustrious of Americans. So I walked around, feeling very illustrious for about 50 or 60 years. And then suddenly I realized that was a whole bunch of bullshit, excuse my language. And thanks to present company, that's how I realized. Thank you so much for helping me realize. And then, I didn't really know what to do about any of this, but somehow I wound up being on a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council with Doctors Without Borders, which has been a fascinating experience, and directly as a result of learning about this stuff, me really mad that we've been living high on the hog and these other people have been living in tenements for 150 years. And so that has actually been one of the most fun things I can remember doing, and has brought me in contact with people that I otherwise never would have known, who I felt very sort of loved and embraced by, and which has been a fantastic experience for me, and one of the best experiences I can remember. So just a thought to throw out for, you know, if we can figure out ways to maybe get young people more interested, it can actually be very fun and wonderful to be involved in this type of work.
Thank you for all you do, Mark. Very inspirational.
Thank you.
I remember being in elementary school and studying Civil War in 5th grade. And I remember at the end of it thinking, thank God I'm from the North. And now I have to think that.
Well, I think there's going to be lots of opportunities to get involved in various ways. So, I mean, you know, we've got the RepGen thing going, we've got all these projects, we have, you know, in the future, a potential lobbying campaign, you know, for the Black GI Bill to fix that wrong. You could imagine 100 J descendants descending onto Congress, right? I mean, like that's like, we could do that, right? That's possible. We also have the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the Revolutionary War and the independence of the country coming up, right, in 2026. And the J Homestead is going to be one of the focal points in New York State for that ongoing celebration. So there's a great opportunity as well there to impact a little bit, you know, how that's celebrated, and to kind of come together as a family. So there's a lot of opportunity to kind of talk to your own family. You know, that's what I recommend right now in terms of just telling people about this. We can share this video, which I think has given a ton of really concrete information for people. And we just kind of keep on talking about it. And we've been meeting about once a month, you know, and everyone's welcome to join those meetings. We have an electronic that we've been paying for, but we haven't really used it. But you know, that's there, and if we decide we want to start using it to communicate and share and post, you know, it's ready to go, and we have maybe already 80 people who have signed up on that. So those are kind of our assets and kind of where we are, you know, at the moment. I think we might be able to kind of close the Zoom.
I have one question.
But yeah, sure.
When you're talking about some kind of acknowledgement plate or monument for people who have endured slavery, have you been thinking have you been thinking about the Schieffelin equivalent for people who suffered slavery? The Schieffelin are the
Sidewalk stone.
Pardon?
The sidewalk stones.
Yeah.
Is that what they called in English? Okay, yeah, the small golden golden stones for people who have my Jewish friends and family who died in the time of concentration camps and the Holocaust. And I've been involved with that for one of my uncles. And I just wondered whether there might be an opportunity for the sidewalk stones to be part of. I wanted to know whether you've been thinking about it.
We haven't thought about that specific means of memorial, but I would love to learn more about it. I mean, I think what's exciting is that Brooke is very involved with Monuments Lab, which is really an organization that's all about trying to figure out how to raise awareness through monuments for historical legacies. And so, but yeah, by all means, send us articles. And I would like, a great idea. I would encourage, you know, like we have this core group that's me, my mom, Ben, Willie, and Robert. We meet, and we would love more people to come. So if you're interested in this, let us know. We can add you to the list. And not all of us make it every month, but it's a really great way to recenter and refocus and share what we've been doing. And So more people would be certainly welcome to join us on our regular Zoom calls.
Because, sorry, I'm still learning Zoom etiquette.
Yeah.
I should have been very slow. But I know Bruce and Jay are here next week.
Yeah.
Willy is here. Might you consider the possibility of somewhere having a schmooze session? Because you have such amazing knowledge and initiatives
Clarity.
and clarity. Yeah, it's so odd that if there could be a brief tea somewhere to say, hey, I don't know whether you would find that
So,
painful or offensive.
So-
I'm sorry, I'm suddenly thinking. Well, it's also the memorial time for me.
Three
Yeah.
people.
I think it's.
It's wrong, Jenny.
We chose it today because next week is
There's
just so.
too much happening, and the question around the memorial, I think we really have to step back and engage the local.
Yeah.
African-American, community to have them contribute what they think, because they may not, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I would say yes, and like, I don't think a lot of stuff is gonna happen unless this group kind of makes it happen, right? It's not like stuff is bubbling up organically. So we're gonna be as inclusive as we can. This is delicate stuff. We're all learning. But these memorial stones, I never heard of that. So like we get smarter the more we talk to each other. And there's nothing like that at the J Homestead, right? Wouldn't that be interesting? There's no memorial whatsoever at the J Homestead. There is a big new exhibition that's being put on, and we're in touch with them about that. They're going to be highlighting the role of enslaved people at the homestead.
And
And
the curator of that whole effort is an African-American woman who is the New York State African-American interpreter of African-American history. So the homestead is doing it right. Engaging.
right, but this is all, New York State, this is official, this is the act of actual remembrance of like taking ownership, that's something that really different if it comes from J descendants, right? It's just different. And so thinking about how we do that, and in fact, the people who are interested in any kind of remembrance or memorial, whether it's Abigail in Paris or the enslaved folks at the homestead, I think it'd be great, like you guys should talk to Jay and Brooke, for sure.
Yeah,
For sure about this, because we're not gonna figure it all out in one meeting. It's gonna be side conversations, all that kind of stuff.
This video is going to be available somehow or another,
Yeah, I'll put it on.
because I want Zachary to
Yeah.
be able to see it too.
Yeah.
He'll be
So-
interested.
In response, my first response to those plaques are stunningly moving when you come across them. My experience has been that it's mostly in urban areas where you see the numbers, and you just walk down the street and there they all are. This is a bit different in New York, only because it's rural. And that would.
Yeah.
So
Although,
It's
Shani,
like-
as I listen to this discussion, I think it's, I had this vision of 17 paving steps leading up to the gate or leading up to the homestead redone mansion with the name and dates of each enslaved person on it. It could be quite dramatic. I know when I went to the slavery memorial in Nantes, France, in Brittany, they had leading up to it in the ground an image and a date and a name for every slave trip, every slave trader, every ship that made a trip out of that port. It was dozens and dozens, and it was arresting. And so even though it's a rural area, Bedford or even Rye, you could have some kind of interesting way in which you you sort of tell this story underfoot as you're walking in. And
So-
I would be happy to have a tea or a coffee next week, even though it's the week of the dead, and and have get together informally and talk some of these things over. So,
Give this J project. What your relationship is with the board at the J Homestead.
We have a friendly relationship. We know them, and you know, I think once we have some idea of what we want to do, you know, we'll talk to them, and you know, they seem pretty open to listening to us. You know, I don't think there was a really strong presence of descendants until recently, and you know, and we've been showing up at their events and stuff like that. So
There are other descendants who are not descendants of Bob.
right.
Oh, yeah.
And we've been trying to reach out to them. In fact, we've had some conversations. We've actually gone to people's funerals to meet them.
Yeah, so Chef Brown went to Peter J. Peter J. was a guy who died this year in his 80s maybe. And he was Washington DC located. There is a William J. living who is a Federalist lawyer in DC, and William was Peter's son. Shep went to the funeral, not knowing anybody, but he was kind of like a recruiter of sorts. And he met William J. was not interested, which doesn't surprise me. However, there was a person who is like 10th removed cousin to me, or 9th removed cousin, named Robert
Bacon.
And he lives in Lexington, Massachusetts. So Willie and I have met him. He's an Episcopal priest, and prior to that, he owned a deep sea diving operation. And Willie knows the story. I don't, and maybe we're not going to go into it, but he had an epiphany. A priest, and he's a very jocular, unpriest-like guy. I mean, I met him, he was wearing flip-flops and
Modern
shorts.
priest.
He was not in his priest attire. And he's very interested. He's on sabbatical. He's doing stuff for the Episcopal Church related to the environmental issues, but he's somebody we're keeping in the loop. He hasn't become engaged in he didn't know any of the history either.
Well, I think we should probably wrap it up before this video gets too long. But
Yeah.
I would like to bring it back to the history. We were talking about paving stones. Well, our ancestor Jacob Schieffelin, where he's buried, his headstone is the front step of the church in Harlem, right? So a lot of us have been to that church because where Jay and Brooke got married.
Yeah.
And so when you go into that church, you walk over Jacob Schieffelin's name, right? So maybe it's not so insulting. I don't know. Anyway, but I want to center it back on Jacob and his wife, Hannah Lawrence Schieffelin, right? So Hannah Lawrence, who was a prolific writer and a revolutionary, marries Jacob Schieffelin during the Revolution. In 1781, this is after Jacob Schieffelin escaped from the Americans and went back to New York City pretending to be a Frenchman. He was, billeted in the Lawrence household, and he managed to steal their daughter's hand in marriage, right? And she was a pamphleteer for the Revolution under the name Matilda. So she was a gifted writer, really gifted. And they made a journey in 1781 from New York City to Jacob Schieffelin's home, which was Detroit. A lot of our family don't realize that. But this Jacob Schieffelin was based out of Detroit. He got captured when he was the lieutenant of the Detroit militia, which was a loyalist force that was about 2/3 American Indian. He was he was also the British Indian Affairs agent for Detroit. So basically he negotiated all these Indians to form the force and then helped lead. He was second in command of the force. So they made this journey from New York City via boat around all the way up the St. Lawrence Seaway, past Niagara Falls, all the way to Detroit during the war. And she wrote an account of this story in her own hand, and it's in New York Public Library. And in this account, she describes how when things got rough on the river, when the rapids were rough and it was a lot of spray, it was really uncomfortable in these boats. And so she and Jacob Schieffelin were able to escape to a carriage that went along the side. It was a lot more comfortable, but her servants stayed in the boat. Now, were those servants slaves or not? It's kind of hard for us to know for sure. But Jacob Schieffelin in 1800, in the 1800 census, when he was, this is many years later, 20 years later, 19 years later, when he was in New York City, he enslaved 5 people in the year 1800. So almost certainly these servants that they left behind on these really uncomfortable boats while they got to go comfortably were enslaved people. And in that story, in this account, she describes how the men who were pushing the boats against the current up the river, this is November, the river started freezing and there were thin layers of ice on the river, and they were pushing boats through this ice with the men walking in the river, right? And they were getting cuts on their legs to the point that the men who were pushing the boats refused to push the boats any further. And Jacob Schieffelin, and they were right at like a small fort, and the commander of that fort imprisoned the men in a barn until they accepted that they had to keep on pushing the boats up the river. And so
all the more frozen.
yeah, it was maybe all the more frozen. It doesn't say that, I don't think.
But the weather would have been cold.
Freezing. So this is how we got here. It was via Detroit, right? A lot of people, and you're doing this reparation work in Detroit, so there's some full circle moments, right? And you know, it's also like a lot of people, like Detroiters, most Detroiters, I think, aren't aware that slavery was an institution, and so it's just very complex, and also like it's a real opportunity to do a reset in how we think about ourselves as a country and a family.
The reparation generation is also has the same goal of a reset. How the economics.
So you're in touch with them and you keep us posted.
Well, Willie and I and others have made these grants already. We've already transferred stuff, and we will do more. And we welcome all of you to do what you can. And I will, or one of us will send out an email to each of you to let you know when you go on the website, it will show you how to make your donation. You can do it by mail, by a credit card, or through your donor advised fund, if you have such a fund. So those are 3 different ways. Okay.
But you want to wrap us up then?
Yeah, well, I don't think there's much more to say. It's been a very productive year, and we hope to have another really productive year so we can come back here next year and talk about what we've learned and what we're doing. And this is really, again, you know, just to remind everyone, it's about education. It's about memory and memorialization, and it's about action for the future. So that is what we're about here. And it's not about, you know, I mean, people have different motivations for this, and you can have your own motivation and talk about it however you want. but those are the three things that we all care about with this project. So thank you all for coming, and we're going to officially conclude this meeting of the J Project.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Unbelievable.